Witness this: a man being lowered into darkness on ropes, hands bound behind his back, late afternoon light filtering through gray English sky. Spring, 865 AD, beneath the fortress at York. The pit was 20 feet deep, carved into rock, circular, maybe 12 feet across. Stone walls worn smooth by centuries of use as a grain store before someone decided it could serve a different function. Ragnar Lothbrok, mid-50s, weathered face, Viking ringmail stripped away hours earlier, wearing only a tunic that clung to his frame with the sweat of waiting. The ropes creaked. He descended slowly, controlled, while men above held the lines taut. At the bottom, movement in the straw. Not a carpet of serpents like the saga writers would claim centuries later, just enough. 15, maybe 20 adders, cold-blooded and irritable in the spring damp, their bodies coiled and sluggish until the weight of a man landing among them triggered something ancient in their nervous systems. The ropes went slack. Ragnar stood for a moment, looking up at the circle of faces rimming the pit's edge. He didn't scream. Not yet. He spoke, voice carrying up through stone. "My sons will come for you, Ælla, and when they do, you'll wish you'd given me a clean death." Then the first snake struck his calf, fangs sinking through fabric into muscle. Then a second, at his ankle. Then the screaming started, and the men above turned away, except for one, a boy of 16, Ella's son, Ælfwine, who kept watching until his father pulled him back from the edge. One adder bite rarely kills a grown man. 20 bites over 3 hours? Different mathematics. Ælla thought he was making an example. He was signing a death warrant for his kingdom. 6 weeks later, a ship crossed the North Sea in weather too rough for sensible sailing, but grief doesn't wait for favorable winds. At the prow sat a young man, maybe 25, thin frame wrapped in furs against the spray, his legs folded beneath him in a way that suggested they couldn't bear his weight, even if he wanted them to. Ivar Ragnarsson held a letter that had arrived too late, brought by a traitor who'd witnessed the execution and thought one of Ragnar's sons might pay for the information. The traitor was right. Ivar paid him 3 silver marks and the promise he wouldn't be killed for delivering bad news. Then Ivar sat with that letter for 2 days, reading it over and over until he'd memorized not just the words, but the spacing between them. The hesitation in certain phrases where the traitor's scribe had struggled to describe what he'd seen. By the time land appeared on the horizon, East Anglia's low coast, marsh and shore, Ivar had stopped reading. He'd begun making a list instead, carved into a piece of driftwood with the point of his knife. 4 names, cut deep enough that his fingers could trace them in the dark. Ella's name sat at the top. Below it, 3 others. Beorhtric, the ealdorman who'd organized the logistics. Osric, the thegn who'd suggested the pit specifically and caught the snakes himself. Wulfhere, the bishop who'd blessed the execution and quoted scripture about serpents and heathens. And at the bottom, added after long consideration, a 4th name that Ivar had almost left off the list, but couldn't quite justify erasing. Ælfwine, the boy who'd watched and said nothing. Before we dive into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy the hidden truths of history, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. To understand why that list became a death sentence for an entire kingdom, you have to understand what Ragnar was and what his death meant to the generation that survived him. The popular version paints him as a legendary warrior king, a Viking Achilles who terrorized Europe and died in glorious defiance. That's the Netflix version, good for merchandise and dramatic last stands. The truth was colder and more dangerous. Ragnar Lothbrok, a assuming he was one man and not a composite of several raiders operating in the 840s through 860s, was a strategic operator who understood something most of his contemporaries didn't: that violence worked best when deployed precisely, and that gold extracted through negotiation lasted longer than gold stolen in a raid. He'd hit Paris in the 840s, sailed up the Seine with a fleet, and instead of sacking the city, had accepted 7,000 pounds of silver to leave. Not because he couldn't take Paris, he probably could have, but because a city that pays you once will pay you again, and a burned city is just ashes. By the time he was 50, Ragnar had raided or traded with every major power from Dublin to Byzantium, and his reputation preceded him like a letter of credit. When he arrived somewhere, kings calculated cheaper to pay him or fight him. Most chose payment. His final voyage to England in 864 was supposed to be a political probe, not a military operation. 2 ships, small crew, enough warriors to look serious, but not enough to threaten. Ælla had seized Northumbria's throne 3 years earlier in a civil war, and Ragnar wanted to see if this new king would be like the old generation, hungry for trade, scared of Viking fleets, willing to negotiate. What Ragnar didn't account for was that Ælla wasn't secure. He was a usurper who'd taken the throne from Osric, driven his rival north, but never quite finished him, and every lord in Northumbria was waiting to see if he'd slip. A Viking delegation arriving at York was either an opportunity or a test, depending on what Ælla did with it. The storm that wrecked Ragnar's ships off the Northumbrian coast made the decision for him. Luck, weather, bad navigation, it doesn't matter which. What matters is that when Ælla's men found survivors from those wrecked ships straggling through the countryside, cold and disarmed, they didn't see a trade opportunity. They saw legitimacy. A Viking lord in chains meant Ælla wasn't weak. It meant God favored Christian kings over pagans. It meant the nobles who'd been whispering about his questionable claim to the throne might shut up for a season. The execution was decided in a timber hall where the walls still smelled of fresh-cut oak and political anxiety. Ælla on a throne that was really just a larger chair, trying to look like he'd been born to it. Around him, the men who mattered: ealdorman Beorhtric of Deira, scarred hands from 30 years of Saxon warfare, the kind of soldier who'd survived by knowing when to follow orders and when to interpret them creatively. Bishop Wulfhere, who'd blessed 2 previous regime changes and had a talent for making God agree with whoever currently controlled the tax revenue. Then Osric, younger, ambitious, who'd read the Venerable Bede's accounts of how early Saxon kings executed traitors and wanted something that would be remembered. And Ælfwine, Ælla's 16-year-old son, who said nothing but watched everything, learning what kingship cost. The debate lasted maybe an hour. A sword made Ragnar a warrior, a rope made him a criminal, but a pit of serpents. Osric leaned forward, speaking carefully. That makes him a warning that lasts generations. Ælla agreed. Not because he was cruel, but because he was desperate. And Wulfhere blessed it, quoting psalms about smiting the wicked, making the whole thing holy instead of just political murder wearing a crown. Osric was right. The pit was remembered, just not the way he'd hoped. What the saga writers don't tell you, what nobody tells you, is that Ragnar's sons didn't leap onto ships the day they heard their father was dead. They waited 18 months, not because they didn't care, but because amateur revenge gets you killed and professional revenge gets you a kingdom. That gap between grief and action, that's where this story lives. Ivar spent those months building something the Vikings had never quite assembled before. Not a raid, not even a military campaign, but an occupying force with logistics. He reached out to every lord who'd ever sailed with Ragnar, every jarl who owed the family a debt or wanted a piece of England's wealth, every warrior who understood that Ælla's message wasn't just about Ragnar, it was about all of them. If a Saxon king could throw a Viking lord into a snake pit and face no consequences, then no treaty was safe, no ransom sacred, no negotiation worth the breath it took to propose it. Ivar made the case systematically. This wasn't about one man's death. This was about whether Viking law meant anything when Saxon kings got nervous about their legitimacy. By November 865, when the fleet assembled in East Anglia's river mouths, it wasn't 30 or 40 ships. It was closer to 80, carrying somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 warriors, plus mobile forges, plus horses. Vikings bringing their own mounts meant they weren't planning to raid and leave. They were planning to stay. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle called them the Great Heathen Army, and that name tells you everything about how the English saw what was coming. Not a raid, not even an invasion, an apocalypse with ships. But here's what makes Ivar different from every other Viking leader who'd hit England before. He didn't want just conquest. He wanted specific men dead in specific ways for specific reasons. On that ship crossing the North Sea, while his brothers Ubba and Halfdan and Bjorn discussed strategy and plunder and how many kingdoms they could carve up, Ivar sat apart with his list and worked through the mathematics of proportional revenge. Viking law, based on centuries of thing assemblies and legal codes that wouldn't be written down for another 200 years, but existed in every warrior's head, recognized blood debt. If someone killed your kinsman without honor, you owed them equivalent harm, not random violence, not collective punishment unless the collective had participated. Equivalent harm. That meant Ivar couldn't just storm York and kill everyone who'd been within a mile of that pit. He had to identify who gave the order, who organized it, who participated, who witnessed. He had to build a case that would satisfy not just his grief, but the army of warriors who'd followed him across the North Sea and needed to believe they were doing something lawful by Viking standards, not just butchery wearing a legal excuse. This is where revenge becomes operations planning. Ivar wasn't Batman hunting the Joker. He was building a target deck, priority levels, locations, vulnerabilities, secondary effects. 4 men, 4 levels of guilty, 4 different deaths, calibrated to crime. And yes, that's exactly as cold as it sounds. But to understand how he could even attempt this, hunting 4 specific men in a hostile kingdom while conquering said kingdom and not losing his army to desertion, or getting his brothers killed, or having the whole thing collapse into chaos. You have to understand what England was in 865. Not a country. 7 kingdoms in a cage fight, each with better historical claims than the others. None strong enough to finish the job. Wessex controlled the south, growing stronger under a series of competent kings. Mercia dominated the Midlands, the biggest and richest kingdom, dangerous when unified. East Anglia held the eastern coast, weaker but positioned between the others like a buffer state trying not to get crushed. And Northumbria, Ælla's prize, stretched across the north, geographically massive, politically fractured, recently split between Ælla in the south and his rival Osbert in the north, both claiming to be the legitimate king, and neither quite able to prove it with swords. Ælla was the newest godfather in a mafia system where everyone hated everyone else slightly more than they hated Vikings, and nobody was strong enough to enforce peace. That's the world Ivar sailed into. Not a unified resistance, a collection of nervous kingdoms watching each other and trying to figure out if a Viking army landing in East Anglia was their problem or their neighbor's problem. King Edmund of East Anglia made his calculation fast. Let the Vikings through, point them at Ælla. Maybe they'll weaken your rival and you can pick up the pieces. So when Ivar's fleet arrived at the River Yare near modern Norwich, Edmund's representatives met them with terms. Pay us to winter here, swear you come in peace, and we'll look the other way while you march north. Ivar took the deal. He lied about the peace part. He had no intention of leaving Northumbria intact. But that's a problem for Act 3. What mattered in November 865 was that he'd bought time and position, and now he could start the actual work of turning a kingdom against itself while hunting 4 men through the chaos. That first winter in East Anglia, Ivar didn't train his army for a siege. He trained them for interrogation. Every farm they requisitioned supplies from, every village that sent representatives to negotiate safe passage, every Saxon trader who came to sell the Vikings food or horses or information, they all got asked the same questions. Where is Beorhtric? Where is Osric? Where is Bishop Wulfhere? Where is King Ælla? The answers came slowly, piece by piece, building a map not of geography, but of power. Who stood close to Ælla? Who flinched when his name was mentioned? Who owed him debts, and who collected them? By spring 866, when the army finally moved north, Ivar knew more about Ælla's court than most of Ælla's own lords did, and that's when he made his first kill. The popular version says England in 865 was Christian versus pagan, civilization versus barbarism, 7 kingdoms standing together against Viking hordes. That's propaganda written by the winners and losers both, each trying to make their side look more unified than it was. The truth was messier and more interesting. England wasn't 7 kingdoms preparing to unite. It was 7 crime families in a permanent state of managed hostility, each one waiting for the others to show weakness, each calculating whether alliance or conquest made better economic sense this year. Northumbria had fought Mercia 3 times in the previous decade. Wessex and Kent couldn't agree on where the border was. East Anglia paid tribute to Mercia some years and told Mercia to go to hell in others, depending on who had a bigger army that season. The Viking invasions didn't shatter English unity. They exposed that unity had never existed in the first place. What Ivar was sailing into wasn't a country. It was a market where violence was currency and loyalty was a quarterly expense that had to justify itself every few months. The mechanics of this world ran on roads the Romans had built 7 centuries earlier, and nobody had quite managed to destroy yet. Stone highways connecting London to York, York to Chester, Chester to Wales, a spider web of imperial infrastructure that now served petty kingdoms trying to remember how empires worked. Those roads carried messengers, 3 days from York to Tamworth, 5 days from Tamworth to Winchester if you pushed the horses. Information moved at the speed of exhausted animals, which meant that when something happened in Northumbria, Wessex didn't know about it for a week, and by the time they'd decided what to do about it, the situation had already changed twice. Strategic coordination was functionally impossible. Tactical alliance meant showing up with an army and hoping your supposed ally hadn't made a better deal with your enemy in the time it took you to march there. Trust was a luxury this world couldn't afford and didn't pretend to value. Ivar understood this within days of landing. He'd spent the voyage across the North Sea imagining England as a unified opponent, a single strategic problem that required a single solution. The reality was better. East Anglia's King Edmund met the Viking fleet with envoys carrying bread and salt and a proposal that amounted to, "Stay here, pay rent. We won't fight you if you march north toward our enemies." Edmund wasn't weak. He was rational. His kingdom sat between Mercia to the west and the sea to the east, with Northumbria to the north. 3 directions of potential threat. An army of 1,500 Vikings wasn't his problem if he could make it Ælla's problem instead. So he charged them for the privilege of wintering on his land, extracted oaths that everyone knew were meaningless, and told his lords they were being clever. Ivar took the deal because it gave him exactly what he needed: time to train, position to strike north, and proof that English kingdoms would sell each other out for tactical advantage. That lesson was worth more than the silver they paid Edmund. The winter camp at Thetford, later sources would place the main force there, near East Anglia's border with Mercia, became a logistics operation that looked less like a raid and more like a provisional government. Vikings had been hitting England for 70 years by this point, ever since Lindisfarne burned in 793, but those were summer expeditions. Sail in May, raid through August, sail home before autumn storms made the North Sea a graveyard. The Great Heathen Army was different. They brought forges for weapon repair. They brought smiths who could work iron and bronze. They brought horses, not stolen English horses, their own mounts that had crossed the sea in specially built ships, which meant they'd planned for sustained cavalry operations inland. They built permanent structures, not tents. They dug latrines according to a system that suggested someone understood how disease worked in large camps. This wasn't a raid that happened to last longer than usual. This was colonization wearing armor. Ivar watched all of it from his cart, unable to walk unassisted, but able to see everything. His brothers commanded formations, led training exercises, settled disputes between jarls about who got which plunder when it came. Ivar sat apart with maps, crude things drawn on hide by traders and prisoners, constantly updated as information came in, and played out scenarios. If we march north next month, what does Ælla know about our strength? If we raid Mercia first, do we lose surprise on Northumbria? If we split the army, do the English pick us off piecemeal, or do they remain too suspicious of each other to coordinate? He ran these calculations aloud sometimes, testing theories on Halfdan, who had a gift for seeing what Ivar missed. Halfdan pointed out that winter marching would kill more men than combat would, that if they waited until spring, the English would see them coming, but wouldn't be able to harvest their fields, which meant besieging a city in summer left the defenders eating last year's grain while the Vikings ate this year's. That patience was a weapon if you had supply lines and your enemy didn't. By March 866, Ivar had refined the plan to something that might actually work. Don't march on York directly. Instead, probe the roads between East Anglia and Northumbria, hitting small targets, asking questions, building a map of who mattered in Ælla's kingdom. The first village they hit was a manor held by a sub-thegn who owed service to ealdorman Beorhtric, one of the 4 names on Ivar's list. The Vikings didn't storm it at dawn like a raid. They surrounded it at night, blocked the exits, and waited until morning, when the smoke from breakfast fires would tell the people inside that attempting to flee would mean running into a shield wall in the dark. At first light, Ivar had himself carried to the main door. The manor was a timber hall, nothing fancy, the kind of place that housed maybe 30 people, including slaves and servants. He shouted in Saxon, which he'd spent the winter learning with enough fluency to make threats and promises. The door opened. The thegn's name was Wulfstan, a man in his 40s who'd been at York the previous spring, not in the room where Ragnar died, but in the garrison, close enough that he'd heard the screaming from the pit. Ivar asked him one question: "Where is your lord Beorhtric?" Wulfstan hesitated, calculating whether honesty or loyalty would keep him alive longer. Ivar let the silence stretch, let Wulfstan look at the warriors surrounding his hall, let him do the math. Finally, He's in York, with King Ælla. I swear I'm just... Ivar cut him off. Were you at York last spring, when the Dane was executed? Silence again, longer this time. Then quietly. I was in the courtyard. I wasn't in the room. Ivar studied him. If I learn you're lying about where Beorhtric is, I'll come back and burn everything you love. If you're telling the truth, we'll remember you cooperated. He left the manor standing. Not mercy, mathematics. Word would spread that cooperation might earn survival, resistance guaranteed death, and the difference between those outcomes was information about 4 specific men. They hit 3 more manors that spring, each time asking the same questions, building a network of intelligence that mapped Ælla's court like a diagram. Beorhtric was in York, confirmed by multiple sources. Osric, the thegn who'd caught the snakes, was also there, staying close to Ælla because he was smart enough to know that Ivar was coming, and distance from the king meant vulnerability. Bishop Wulfhere was in York as well, because bishops went where the money was, and Ælla controlled Northumbria's tax collection. And the boy, Elfwine, witnesses disagreed. Some said he was in York with his father. Others claimed Ælla had sent him to a monastery for education, which might have been true, or might have been Ælla trying to put his son somewhere that oaths of sanctuary might protect him. Ivar added that uncertainty to his map. If the boy was in a monastery, he'd be easier to isolate. If he was in York, he'd fall with the city. But Ælla himself was the harder problem, and this is where you have to kill the cartoon version of the man. The popular image paints him as a cruel tyrant who threw people into snake pits for entertainment, a sadist who enjoyed suffering. That's not who Ælla was, and if you think that, you'll misunderstand everything that happened next. Ælla was a usurper who'd seized Northumbria's throne in 863 during a civil war, deposing Osbert, who had better bloodline claims but worse military instincts. The seizure had been efficient and relatively bloodless by the standards of 9th century power transfers. Ælla had bribed half of Osbert's supporters, intimidated the other half, and driven Osbert north into Bernicia before the deposed king could organize resistance. Clean work, professional. The problem was that being good at taking power and being good at keeping power required different skills, and Ælla had mastered only the first. He'd spent 3 years trying to convince Northumbrian lords that his questionable legitimacy didn't matter because he was competent, strong, favored by God, capable of protecting them from Mercia to the south and the Picts to the north. Every decision he made was calculated to project strength. The taxes he collected, the justice he dispensed, the alliances he negotiated, all of it designed to make people forget that his grandfather hadn't been king, and his father hadn't been king, and technically nobody in his bloodline had ever held this throne before him. Ragnar's arrival in 864 should have been an opportunity. A famous Viking lord showing up with 2 ships and a trade delegation. Ælla could have made a treaty, extracted tribute, turned the relationship into propaganda about how even legendary raiders respected Northumbrian strength. But the timing was wrong. Osbert was making noises about reclaiming the throne. Several major lords hadn't paid their taxes that year, and the church was questioning whether Ælla's coronation had been properly blessed given the speed and violence of his coup. Ælla needed a win more than he needed a trade partner. When Ragnar's ships wrecked in a storm and survivors washed up on Northumbrian beaches, disarmed and vulnerable, Ælla saw something better than a treaty. He saw legitimacy wrapped in wet clothing and begging for mercy. The decision to execute Ragnar publicly, to make it theatrical rather than quick, came from Osric, the young thegn who'd read too much Bede and wanted to be remembered for cleverness. A sword made Ragnar just another dead Viking. A rope made him a criminal executed according to law. but a pit of serpents? That was biblical. Old Testament. Pharaoh's magicians, and the snake that ate other snakes, and all the weight of Scripture behind the symbolism of serpents representing heathens and evil and everything that Christian kings were meant to destroy. Wulfhere, the bishop, backed this interpretation enthusiastically because it made Ælla look like God's instrument rather than a nervous usurper killing a prisoner. And Beorhtric organized the execution because that's what ealdorman did. Turned royal commands into physical reality, making sure someone dug the pit deep enough and caught enough snakes and tested the ropes to ensure the condemned man descended slowly instead of dropping all at once and breaking his neck before the venom could work. Ælfwine, Ælla's son, attended because his father required it. 16 years old, not yet a warrior, but no longer a child, standing at the rim of that pit learning what kingship demanded. When Ragnar looked up during his descent and spoke his curse, "My sons will come for you." Ælfwine had met those eyes briefly before his father pulled him back. That moment would sit in the boy's memory for the rest of his life, however long that turned out to be. He'd seen a man who knew he was dying and chose to spend his last seconds making a promise instead of begging. That's a lesson you don't forget. So by the time Ivar's army began moving north in late spring 866, Ælla knew they were coming. Refugees from the villages Ivar had interrogated made it to York, carrying stories about Vikings who asked for specific names and let people live if they cooperated. Ælla understood what that meant. This wasn't a normal invasion where you defended your walls and waited for the attackers to run out of food. This was targeted, personal. 4 names kept appearing in the reports. His own, Beorhtric's, Osric's, Wulfhere's. The boy's name appeared less frequently, which suggested either Ivar had mercy or didn't consider a 16-year-old worth the effort. Ælla convened his war council and laid out the situation with clarity that you had to respect, even if you hated him. The Vikings had maybe 1,500 warriors. Northumbria could field perhaps 2,000 if Ælla called every banner, but that would take weeks and leave territories undefended. York's walls were Roman stone, strong enough to hold against assault if adequately garrisoned. The strategic options were: meet the Vikings in the field before they reached York, accept a siege and hope relief arrived from Mercia or Wessex, or negotiate with Ivar and hope he'd accept terms that didn't involve torturing Northumbria's king to death. Beorhtric voted for meeting them in the field. He was a soldier, practical, and he trusted his ability to form a shield wall more than he trusted city walls that hadn't been tested in decades. Osric argued for negotiation, offer Ivar gold, a symbolic execution of whoever he blamed most, anything to avoid full-scale war. Wulfhere quoted scripture about divine protection but didn't actually commit to a position, which was typical Wulfhere. Ælfwine said nothing, but his presence in that room mattered because it meant Ælla was thinking about succession, about what happened if the worst occurred. The decision Ælla ultimately made revealed something important about him. He chose neither defense nor negotiation. He chose to let the Vikings come closer, burn a few more villages, overextend their supply lines, and then hit them when they were tired and far from their base in East Anglia. It was a competent plan. It accounted for logistics, terrain, the political reality that he couldn't look like a coward who hid behind walls. The problem was that the plan assumed Ivar was a normal Viking leader following normal Viking strategy. Ivar wasn't normal. And the strategy he was running didn't appear in any saga or tactical manual because nobody had tried it before. While Ælla was preparing for a conventional campaign, thinking about where to position forces, which roads to defend, how to force the Vikings into terrain that favored shield walls, Ivar was doing something simpler and nastier. He was making Ælla's kingdom turn on itself. Every village the Vikings interrogated, every lord who gave up information to save his household, every Saxon who decided that protecting Beorhtric or Osric or Wulfhere wasn't worth dying for. All of it was corrosion. By June 866, Ælla's lords were looking at each other and wondering who'd cooperate with the Vikings when they came, who'd hand over the four names to save themselves, who could be trusted, and who was calculating exit strategies. That suspicion, that fracture in the court's cohesion, was worth more than 1,000 extra warriors. But the real weapon Ivar had wasn't tactical or psychological. It was temporal. He had time, and Ælla didn't. The Viking army could winter in East Anglia, raid through spring and summer, withdraw if necessary, and return the next year. They'd brought enough supplies for sustained operations, and what they couldn't bring, they could take from the countryside. Ælla's kingdom ran on a tighter margin. Harvest timing mattered. Tax collection mattered. If Northumbrian farmers were hiding in forests or dead in burned villages, nobody was planting crops, which meant next year's famine even if this year's invasion was repelled. Ælla couldn't afford a long war. Ivar could afford nothing else. That asymmetry, one side able to be patient, the other side forced to act, was the hidden structure that determined everything that followed. Ivar knew this because he'd spent his entire life watching his father negotiate from positions that looked weak and turn them into positions of strength through patience and calculation. Ragnar had taught all his sons the same lesson, usually while sitting around a fire during long winter nights when raiding was impossible, and the only thing to do was plan the next year's campaigns. The lesson was simple. Violence is expensive, but waiting is cheap. If you can make your enemy act first, force them to commit resources and position before you do, you've already won half the battle. Ivar had learned this so thoroughly that it had become instinct. His brothers, Ubba, Halfdan, Bjorn, were all better warriors than he was. They could fight in shield walls, lead charges, inspire men through physical presence. Ivar couldn't walk without support. What he could do was sit with maps and see patterns that three-dimensional space made invisible. He could calculate not just where forces were, but where they'd have to be in a month, in 3 months, in a year. He could see the kingdom Ælla was trying to hold together and identify exactly which threads to pull to make it unravel. The decision to actually invade Northumbria, not raid, invade, the difference being intent to stay, was made in late July 866 during a thing assembly held at the East Anglian camp. Ivar called together the jarls and significant warriors who'd crossed the North Sea with the army, and he made his case formally according to Viking legal tradition. He presented evidence of Ragnar's death, the letter from the witness, testimony from the survivors who'd been captured with Ragnar but managed to escape or be ransomed, the documented refusal of ransom that turned execution into murder under Viking law. He called it niddingsverk, a nithing work, a deed so dishonorable that it removed the perpetrator from legal protection. A man who committed niddingsverk could be killed without blood price, his property seized without compensation, his family stripped of status. This wasn't just revenge. This was the law. An older jarl challenged him, skeptical, playing the role of prosecutor that Viking assemblies required. Ragnar went to England with 2 ships and bad weather. His ships wrecked. That's not Ælla's fault. That's poor judgment. Ivar stood. His brothers helped him, held him upright because his legs couldn't bear weight, and spoke slowly, making sure every man heard. My father was captured, disarmed. He offered ransom, gold enough to buy 3 estates. Ælla refused. He didn't want justice. He wanted theater. That's not execution. That's murder wearing a crown. The assembly debated for another hour, arguing precedent and definitions and whether the proposed revenge exceeded what was legally justified. In the end, they agreed. Not because they loved Ragnar, half of them had feuded with him at some point, but because if Ælla could do this to Ragnar Lothbrok and face no consequences, he could do it to any of them. This wasn't just about one man's death. It was about whether treaties and ransoms and the entire structure of negotiated violence that kept Viking society from collapsing into chaos meant anything when Saxon kings got nervous. The Thing's verdict authorized not just revenge, but conquest. Ælla's kingdom was forfeit. Everything he held could be taken lawfully by whoever had the strength to hold it. That legal framework mattered because it kept the army unified. Without it, Jarls would start wondering if they were risking their lives for Ivar's family drama, or for something that would actually profit them. With it, they were executing a legal sentence that happened to come with land and plunder, and the satisfaction of showing Saxon kings what happened when you broke the rules. By September, forces were moving into position, and nobody could stop it anymore. Ælla marched south from York with roughly 800 men, leaving minimal garrison, trying to meet the Viking army before they could entrench further into his territory. Osbert, his deposed rival who still held northern Northumbria, watched all of this from Bernicia and made calculations. A messenger from Ivar had reached him weeks earlier with an offer that was insultingly obvious and strategically perfect. When Ælla leaves York to fight the Vikings, take the city. We won't stop you. When Ælla returns and finds his capital gone, he'll be broken. You'll be king again. All we ask is that when we send for 4 men, specific men, not random prisoners, you hand them over. Osbert took the deal not because he was stupid, but because refusing meant watching Ivar and Ælla destroy each other while he got nothing. At least this way he had a chance. The pieces were locking into place with the inevitability of a sprung trap, and nobody involved, not Ælla, not Osbert, not even Ivar's brothers, completely understood how this would end. Ivar sat in the Viking camp south of York, watching reports come in about Ælla's march, about Osbert's preparations, about the garrison strength left in the city. Halfdan asked him the question that had been sitting unspoken between them all summer. What if we only find 3? What if one of the 4 is already dead or fled? Ivar looked at him with eyes that had spent 18 months getting colder. Then we find their families. The lesson still lands. Bjorn, who'd known their father best, who remembered Ragnar as more than a tactical problem to be solved, objected quietly. Father wouldn't want innocents punished for another's crime. Ivar turned, and for the first time something that wasn't calculation showed in his face. Raw grief wearing armor. Father's dead. I'm deciding what he'd want now. That was the moment you could see it. Ivar had convinced himself this was about law and honor and Viking legal tradition, but underneath all the careful logic was just a son who'd lost his father and wanted someone to pay for it. The next 3 months would reveal whether those 2 motives, legal justice and personal grief, could coexist, or whether one would devour the other and leave nothing but bodies and regret. Here's what Ivar understood that Ælla didn't. You don't need to beat an enemy army if you can make their kingdom collapse behind them, while they're busy trying to fight you. The conventional approach to conquering Northumbria would have been a straight march north from East Anglia, siege warfare at York, months of attrition until someone's supplies ran out or disease did the killing that swords couldn't manage. Expensive, slow, vulnerable to relief forces from Mercia or Wessex showing up and catching the Vikings between 2 armies. Ivar looked at that plan and saw a way to lose while technically winning. Instead, he designed something more elegant and considerably more vicious. He'd make Ælla choose between fighting the Vikings and losing his capital, because he couldn't do both simultaneously, and whichever choice Ælla made would destroy him. The geography made it possible. York sat in the north, roughly 100 miles from where the Viking army had wintered in East Anglia, connected by Roman roads that were still functional if you didn't mind occasional collapsed bridges and sections where the stone had been scavenged for monastery construction. Osric controlled Bernicia, the northern territory, from fortified positions even farther north than York. The math was brutal. If Ælla marched south to engage the Vikings, he'd leave York with a skeleton garrison, and Osric could take the city in days. If Ælla stayed in York, the Vikings would methodically destroy his southern territories, burn his tax base, and strangle his kingdom slowly. If he split his forces, both halves would be too weak to accomplish anything. 3 options, all bad. The kind of strategic position that happens when someone smarter has been arranging the board for months while you were busy trying to look legitimate. Ælla saw the trap closing in September 866, standing in his hall at York while reports came in about Viking movements south of the kingdom. They weren't besieging anything. They were fortifying a position near Torksey, right at the border between Northumbria and Mercia, close enough to raid north into his territory, but far enough that marching to dislodge them meant leaving York exposed for weeks. His war council assembled in that timber hall where the decision to kill Ragnar had been made 18 months earlier, and the symmetry wasn't lost on anyone. Beorhtric stood behind Ælla's chair, looking older than his years, exhausted from months of organizing defenses that kept proving inadequate. Wulfhere sat with his hands folded, radiating ecclesiastical calm that didn't quite reach his eyes. Osric paced, nervous energy barely contained. Knowing that his name was on a list somewhere and that distance from the king meant vulnerability. Elfwine watched from the corner, silent as always, but his presence mattered because it meant Ælla was thinking about what happened if this went wrong. Who'd be left to claim whatever remained of the kingdom? The debate lasted 3 hours. Beorhtric argued for meeting the Vikings in open battle before they could dig in further. "My lord, if we let them fortify and winter over again, next year they'll have twice the numbers. We hit them now, before Mercia decides whether to help them or us." Wulfhere countered with caution, dressed as wisdom. God's protection extends to those who defend his churches, not those who rush into pagan swords seeking glory. The walls of York have held for centuries. Osric, who'd been quiet until now, finally spoke what everyone was thinking. "They're asking for me by name. Your Grace, let me meet them under truce flag. Offer terms." Ælla turned on him with something close to contempt. "Terms? What terms? Please murder me quickly instead of slowly?" The room went quiet. Osric tried again, voice smaller. "They want you, my lord, not the city. If we could arrange a meeting, an ambush..." Ælla stood, and there was something broken in his posture, some acceptance of what was coming that made him more dangerous rather than less. "You think I don't know what this is?" Ælla's voice carried the weight of months spent calculating odds that wouldn't improve. "They don't want me dead. They want me afraid. They want every Saxon king from here to Wessex watching what happens when you kill a Viking lord. If I hide, I'm dead. If I fight and lose, I'm dead. The only choice is how many of them I take with me." That admission hung in the air like smoke. Beorhtric broke the silence. "Then we march. We take 800 men, leave 300 to hold York, and we hit them before they're ready." Ælla nodded, but the decision felt less like strategy and more like suicide with paperwork. He was right about the fear and wrong about everything else. This wasn't about intimidation. It was about accounting, and Ivar wasn't trying to scare future kings. He was balancing a very specific ledger, and terror was just a side effect. The message reached Osbert 2 days later, delivered by one of Ivar's men who spoke Saxon well enough to be understood, and badly enough that the accent made threats sound worse. The offer was insultingly transparent. When Ælla marches south, take York. Ivar's army won't interfere. When Ælla returns and finds his capital gone, he'll be finished. You'll be king again. The price is 4 men, Beorhtric, Osric, Wulfhere, and the boy Elfwine. Hand it over when requested. No questions, no negotiations. Osbert sat in his northern hall, colder and rougher than anything in York, surrounded by lords who'd lost lands to Ælla's coup and wanted them back. The offer split his council immediately. Half saw it as a chance to reclaim what was theirs. The other half saw it as dealing with heathens who'd betray any agreement the moment it became convenient. Osbert listened to both sides, then made a decision that was neither brave nor cowardly, just calculating. He'd take the deal. Not because he trusted Ivar, but because refusing meant watching 2 enemies fight while he got nothing. And at least this way, he had leverage. If Ivar wanted those 4 men badly enough to offer a kingdom in exchange, then those 4 men were currency Osbert could spend later if the deal went wrong. That decision, made in a cold hall 200 miles from where Ragnar had died, sealed Northumbria's fate more completely than any battle would. You had 2 claimants to the same throne, each willing to work with Vikings to destroy the other, each convinced they were being clever, neither understanding that Ivar didn't need either of them to survive. He just needed them to weaken each other enough that when the time came to install whoever was left, they'd be too exhausted to resist. Ælla marched south on September 20th, 866, with roughly 800 men. Not his full strength. He'd left 300 to garrison York, knowing it wasn't enough, but having no better options. The march took 4 days over roads that were decent for the 9th century, which meant stone surfaces interrupted by mud and occasional river crossings where bridges had collapsed and nobody had bothered to repair them. The army moved with the efficiency of professional soldiers who'd spent their lives marching to other people's wars, shield walls that could form in minutes, supply wagons that carried 4 days of food and assumed they'd forage the rest. Beorhtric commanded the vanguard. Osric stayed close to Ælla, nervous but competent enough when violence was actually happening. The king himself rode near the center, not leading from the front, but not hiding either, visible to his men, maintaining the appearance that this was a campaign like any other, and not a funeral march with banners. They found the Vikings entrenched at Torksey on September 24th, and the position was better than Ælla had hoped for and worse than he'd feared. The Vikings had occupied an old monastery, not as blasphemy, but as practicality. Stone walls and elevated ground near the River Trent, defensible and supplied by ship. Maybe 600 warriors visible, which meant either Ivar had split his force or more were hidden in the monastery's buildings. Ælla deployed his men in standard formation, shield wall across the approach, cavalry on the flanks to prevent encirclement, archers behind the line to harass any Viking sortie. Textbook Saxon tactics, the kind of setup that had worked against Viking raids for decades. The problem was, this wasn't a raid, and Ivar wasn't defending the monastery because he needed it. He was defending it because keeping Ælla here, focused on an indecisive engagement, meant Ælla wasn't in York. The battle, if you can call it that, lasted 6 hours and killed maybe 200 men combined. Both sides formed shield walls. Both sides probed for weakness. Ælla's cavalry tried to flank left, got caught in marshy ground near the river, withdrew with losses. The Vikings launched 2 sorties, hit Ælla's line hard, withdrew before the Saxons could reinforce and turn the engagement into a grinding melee that would kill experienced warriors neither side could afford to lose. By mid-afternoon, it was clear this was a draw. The kind of inconclusive bloodletting that tactics manuals call a meeting engagement, because neither side was willing to commit everything to a decisive push. Beorhtric, bloodied but alive, made his way to Ælla as the sun began setting. "My lord, they're withdrawing. Let us pursue." But Beorhtric was too experienced to sound confident about that suggestion, and Ælla was too experienced to fall for the obvious bait. "No, look at them. That's not a rout. That's a planned withdrawal. They want us to chase." The Vikings pulled back into the monastery in good order, shield walls intact, no panic, no collapse. If anything, they looked satisfied, like they'd accomplished what they came for. Ælla claimed victory because technically his forces held the field when the sun set. He sent messages to Mercia and Wessex announcing that Northumbria had repelled a Viking assault, calling for reinforcements to finish the job, requesting supplies and recognition that he'd stood against the Great Heathen Army and lived. The messages would take a week to reach their destinations and another week to get responses, assuming anyone responded at all. Meanwhile, 40 miles north, Osbert was entering York through gates opened from within by lords who'd done the math and decided that betting on Ælla's legitimacy was more expensive than switching sides. No siege, no dramatic storming of walls, just a city changing hands because enough people with keys decided the previous owner wasn't worth defending anymore. That's how kingdoms fall in practice. Not with last stands, but with cost-benefit analysis written in blood and taxes. The news reached Ælla 3 days later, delivered by a rider who'd nearly killed his horse getting south before Osbert's men could stop him. Ælla was standing outside his tent, washing blood off his hands, not his own. He'd killed a Viking warrior in personal combat during one of the sorties, the kind of King Do's battle personally moment that was supposed to inspire troops and prove legitimacy. The rider stumbled off his dying horse and spoke 2 words: "York's fallen." The camp went silent. Ælla didn't move for a long moment, just stood there with water dripping off his fingers, processing what that meant tactically and politically and personally. Beorhtric approached carefully. "My lord, we can march back, retake it. Osbert can't have more than—" Ælla cut him off with a gesture. "He doesn't need more. He has the city. The lords have chosen. If we march back now, we besiege our own capital while Vikings raid our rear. If we stay here, we lose everything north of the Tees." Osric, who'd been quiet since the battle, spoke up with something close to desperation. "We negotiate. Offer Osbert terms. Offer the Vikings terms. Someone will—" Ælla looked at him with eyes that had run out of patience for optimism. "Nobody's offering us terms. We're the ones who'll be begging." The standoff lasted 4 weeks, and it was the kind of strategic paralysis that happens when nobody has good options and everyone's waiting for someone else to make a mistake first. Ælla camped south of York, with his army slowly bleeding deserters, men who looked at the calendar, calculated that harvest season was passing while they sat in a field accomplishing nothing, and decided their farms were more important than their oaths. Osbert held York with enough men to man the walls, but not enough to sally out and force battle. The Vikings stayed at Torksey, occasionally raiding Saxon villages for supplies, never committing to anything that looked like a decisive campaign. It was the 9th century equivalent of a three-way Mexican standoff where everyone's gun was pointed at someone, but nobody wanted to be the first to pull the trigger, because that meant the third party wins. Ivar watched all of this from his position at Torksey, receiving reports from scouts and informants, updating his maps with the compulsive precision of someone who understood that wars were won by logistics more often than courage. His brothers were getting restless. Ubba wanted to march on York immediately, storm the walls while Osbert was still consolidating power. Halfdan argued for hitting Ælla's weakened force, finishing the immediate threat before dealing with the political situation. Bjorn, always more strategic than the other two, saw what Ivar was doing and didn't like it. You're letting them bleed each other. Ælla's losing men every day. Osbert's losing legitimacy, holding a city with Viking permission. But we're losing time. Winter's coming. If we don't move soon, we'll be stuck here until spring. Ivar didn't disagree with the analysis. He disagreed with the conclusion. Let them rot. Every day Ælla stays outside York is another day his lords question whether he's worth following. Every day Osbert holds the city is another day he has to explain to the church why he made deals with heathens. By November, they'll be weak enough that we can take both. Bjorn pushed back, and this was the moment where the plan's fragility showed. And the four men? Beorhtric's with Ælla. Wulfhere's in York with Osbert. They're split. We can't get both without fighting two separate battles. Ivar pulled out that wooden list, studied the 4 names carved deep enough to feel in the dark. His thumb traced Beorhtric's name, then Wulfhere's. Change of plans. We take York first. Osbert hands over Wulfhere. Then we deal with Ælla, get Beorhtric and Osric, then the boy. Halfdan asked the question that had been sitting between them all month. Why Wulfhere first? That's not the order you planned. Ivar's response was cold and precise, the kind of clarity that only comes from months of thinking about exactly how you want specific people to die. Because he blessed it, the others followed orders or held ropes. Wulfhere made it holy. That's the worst crime. That reordering of the list, that decision to prioritize theological complicity over physical participation, told you everything about what Ivar actually cared about. This wasn't just about punishing the men who'd killed his father. It was about making sure the world understood that there were degrees of guilt, that the man who justified murder was worse than the man who committed it, that civilization's real crime wasn't violence, but the sophisticated arguments that made violence seem righteous. The standoff broke on October 28th when Ælla's army started hemorrhaging lords, not deserters, actual nobility who looked at the situation, calculated that Ælla was finished, and decided to make deals with Osbert before they went down with a sinking throne. Ælla woke up one morning to find 3 of his major thanes gone along with their household warriors, maybe 200 men total, enough to shift the military balance from bad to catastrophic. Beorhtric brought the news personally. My lord, they went north during the night. We found tracks but no bodies, which means they weren't ambushed. They left deliberately. Ælla took that information without visible reaction, but something inside him broke or maybe crystallized into acceptance. He called his remaining lords together, maybe 400 men left, and spoke with the kind of honesty that leaders usually save for after they've already lost. We can't take York. We don't have the men. We can't stay here. We don't have the supplies. We can't retreat south without abandoning Northumbria entirely. He let that sink in, let them see the box they were trapped in. So here's what we do. We march to York. We offer Osbert a deal. Face us in open battle. Winner takes the kingdom. Loser leaves or dies. And when the Vikings see 2 Saxon armies destroying each other, Maybe they'll wait to see who wins before they move. Maybe. It wasn't a plan. It was desperation wearing armor. Beorhtric started to object, stopped when he realized there was nothing to object to. This was suicide by committee, and everyone knew it. Osric looked like he was going to be sick. Elfwine, standing in the back, met his father's eyes and nodded once. Not agreement, just acknowledgement that sometimes there are no good choices left, only expensive ones and slightly more expensive ones. Ælla marched north toward York on November 1st with 400 exhausted men who knew they were marching toward a city that wouldn't open its gates and a rival who had no reason to meet them in honest battle. And that's when Ivar made his move. Not to let them fight each other, not to wait and see who won, to hit them both while they were locked in position, to take the city while both claimant kings were too weak to stop him, to collect his 4 names while chaos provided cover. The Great Heathen Army mobilized from Torksey with 1,500 warriors. Full strength now, reinforcements that had been waiting in East Anglia finally brought forward. They marched fast, not taking time to forage or rest, pushing toward York like they knew exactly when the window would open and how long it would stay that way. 3 armies converging on one city, each with different goals, none of them compatible. Ælla trying to force Osbert into battle, Osbert trying to hold York without looking like a Viking puppet, Ivar trying to collect 4 specific men before random violence killed them and made the whole 18 months of planning pointless. It was the kind of situation that military historians call a meeting engagement and survivors call a slaughter, where nobody's plan survives contact with reality, and whoever adapts fastest gets to write the history books. Halfdan, riding beside Ivar's cart as the army moved north, asked one final question. What if they're already dead? What if Ælla killed Osric and Beorhtric rather than let us take them? What if Osbert executed Wulfhere to look tough? Ivar didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was flat, drained of everything except will. Then we improvise. That word, improvise, was doing a lot of work. It meant if the careful plan collapsed, if the proportional revenge became impossible, if the legal framework he'd built to justify this invasion fell apart, then he'd default to something older and simpler. Not justice, just grief with sharp objects, pointed at whoever was still standing when the smoke cleared. The armies reached York on November 1st, 866, from 3 different directions, and nobody was ready for what happened next. Ælla's depleted force approached from the south, Osbert's garrison watched from the walls, and Ivar's Vikings emerged from the woods northeast of the city just after dawn. 1,500 warriors in formation, shields locked, moving with the discipline of an army that had spent months preparing for exactly this moment. Ælla saw them first, turned to Beorhtric with something that might have been relief or might have been the opposite. He's here. The bastard's actually here. Beorhtric understood what that meant. They weren't going to die fighting each other for Osbert's entertainment. They were going to die fighting Vikings, which at least felt cleaner. Ælla gave the order to wheel the formation, face northeast, prepare to meet the Viking advance. Then Osbert made his calculation. He could watch from the walls while Ælla's force was destroyed, then deal with the Vikings afterward. Or he could sortie now, hit the Vikings from behind while they were engaged with Ælla, maybe win this whole disaster through one decisive stroke. He chose the sortie, opened York's gates and led his garrison out, not to help Ælla, but to kill Vikings while they were distracted, which meant 3 armies were now committed to the same field at the same time, and the only certain outcome was that a lot of people were going to die in the next few hours. Ivar, watching from his cart, felt something close to satisfaction. Not joy, not triumph, just the cold recognition that the trap had finally sprung and everyone was exactly where he needed them. His brothers were already moving into position. Ubba toward where Beorhtric would be fighting, Halfdan toward Osric's likely location, Bjorn toward Ælla himself with orders to take the king alive if possible. And Ivar kept his eyes on York's gates, waiting for one specific face. Bishop Wulfhere would be in that sortie. Had to be. Osbert would need the church's blessing for his alliance with Vikings to look like anything other than treason. The bishop would be there, probably toward the rear, wearing religious authority instead of armor. That's where Ivar would find him. After the killing started, when chaos provided cover, when nobody was paying attention to one bishop in a battle that was consuming 3 armies. This wasn't going to be a battle. It was going to be a harvest, and Ivar had brought 4 baskets. The fog hadn't lifted by the time the armies saw each other, November morning in northern England, cold enough that breath hung visible in the air and metal stung bare hands. Ælla's 400 men stood in formation south of York's walls, exhausted from a month of camping and marching. Shields locked in a line that looked professional from a distance but felt thin from within. Behind them, nothing but open ground and the road they'd marched up. In front, York's stone walls and the gates that had just opened to release Osbert's garrison. Maybe 500 men, fresher than Ælla's force but less experienced. The kind of troops that held cities rather than fought field battles. And to the northeast, emerging from the tree line in formations that made Saxon shield walls look improvised, the Great Heathen Army. 1,500 Vikings, moving with the coordinated silence of men who'd drilled these movements until they became reflex. 3 armies, none of them positioned where they wanted to be. All of them committed now because turning around meant exposing your back to enemies who were close enough to smell. Ivar sat in his cart behind the Viking lines, elevated enough to see the field's shape, unable to stand, but able to direct. His brothers had already moved to their positions. Ubba commanding the left wing where he'd intercept Ælla's forces, Halfdan on the right moving to flank Osbert's sortie, Bjorn in the center with the heaviest fighters and specific orders about one man who had to be taken alive. The morning sounds were wrong. Too many men breathing, mail shirts rattling, shields scraping against each other as formations tightened. Someone in Ælla's line vomited, the sound carrying across the 50 yards that separated the armies. A horse screamed somewhere behind Osbert's forces, probably smelling what was about to happen and trying to bolt. The first arrow came from nowhere specific, fired by some Saxon archer whose nerves broke before the formal signal, and it fell short by 20 feet, sticking into mud like an accusation. Then, Ælla gave the order, and his line surged forward, not because they wanted to, but because standing still meant letting the Vikings choose when to engage, and choosing your own death was better than waiting for someone else to schedule it. The shield wall hit the Viking formation with the sound of wood on wood, iron rim scraping iron rim, the specific percussion of military collision that you could hear a mile away if the wind was right. The front ranks compressed, shields overlapping, spears jabbing between the gaps trying to find flesh, while the men behind pushed forward with shoulders against backs, turning human bodies into hydraulic pressure that crushed the warriors at the point of contact. A Saxon thegn in the front rank took a spear through the throat, just above his mail collar, where leather couldn't stop iron, and he went down making sounds that weren't quite words, while his blood sprayed the men beside him. The Viking who killed him stepped into the gap, brought his axe down on a Saxon shield hard enough to split the wood, then took a sword thrust to his gut from a Saxon in the second rank who'd seen the opening. Both men fell, and the lines closed over them, shields locking again, the battle becoming a grinding calculus of who could maintain formation, while men died and new men stepped forward to fill the empty spaces. Osbert's garrison hit the Viking right flank 30 seconds later, catching Halfdan's formation at an angle that should have rolled them up if the Vikings had been normal raiders. They weren't. Halfdan had anticipated the sortie, positioned his men to absorb the impact, and when Osbert's forces hit the shield wall, they found it reinforced 3 ranks deep with warriors who'd been waiting for exactly this. The collision staggered both sides. A horse went down screaming, its rider thrown into the Viking line, where 3 axes found him before he could rise. An older Saxon warrior, gray-bearded and competent, drove his spear through a Viking's eye socket and was working the blade free when someone behind him brought a sayax across his hamstrings, and he collapsed, still holding the spear, suddenly 6 inches shorter and unable to stand. The Vikings stepped over him and kept pushing forward. Not to kill him, he was dying already, but to maintain pressure on Osbert's line before it could establish momentum. Ivar watched the battle develop with the detached focus of someone reading a document in a language only he understood fully. The formations were holding on all sides, which meant this wasn't going to be quick. 3 armies meant 3 separate fights happening simultaneously, and the first side to break would get hit from 2 directions. His warriors knew this. Ælla's men knew this. Osbert's garrison was learning it fast. The optimal strategy was to let the other 2 sides exhaust each other, then move in for the kill. But optimal strategy required trust that the other armies would actually fight instead of both turning on the third force, and nobody trusted anyone here. So everyone fought, and the mathematics of attrition became the only reliable constant. 10 minutes in, maybe 80 men were dead or dying. 20 minutes, that number doubled. The wounded crawled away from the fighting if they could, or got trampled if they couldn't, and the ground became slick with blood and other fluids that made footing treacherous for anyone who wasn't expecting it. Ubba found Beorhtric 40 minutes into the battle, not by accident, but by design. The ealdorman was fighting with Ælla's vanguard, recognizable by his scarred face and the way men near him moved. Veterans who knew his commands, who'd fought beside him for 20 years, who formed around him like he was a load-bearing pillar. Ubba pushed through his own line with 5 warriors following, targeting that cluster specifically because taking out Beorhtric would collapse that section of Ælla's formation, and because Ivar had given him a name to collect. They hit Beorhtric's position like an axe striking a knot in wood. The old ealdorman saw them coming, turned to meet Ubba directly, and for maybe 30 seconds it was skilled warrior against skilled warrior. No tricks, just experience and strength testing each other. Beorhtric's shield caught Ubba's first axe blow, deflected it down and left, created an opening for a counterstrike that would have taken Ubba's arm off if one of the Vikings behind him hadn't blocked it with his own shield. Then the mathematics shifted. 5 Vikings against 1 Saxon, veterans surrounding him, and Beorhtric's defensive position collapsed. Ubba brought his shield edge up into Beorhtric's jaw, broke teeth and bone, staggered him backward. 2 Vikings hit him low, took his legs out, brought him down onto mud that was mostly blood by this point. He tried to rise, couldn't, and Ubba's boot came down on his sword arm, pinning it. "I need him alive," Ubba shouted to his men, and they dragged Beorhtric out of the fight, past the Viking lines, back toward where Ivar waited. The ealdorman fought the whole way, trying to twist free even with broken ribs and a face that was swelling shut, because dying in battle was acceptable, and being captured meant whatever came after. They threw him down near Ivar's cart. Beorhtric looked up through the one eye that could still open, saw Ivar sitting above him, and something in his expression changed from rage to recognition. "You're the crippled son." Ivar looked down at him without emotion. "And you're the man who organized my father's execution. We'll talk about proportional punishment later. Right now, you're just going to sit here and watch." Osric died 30 yards away, killed by accident and bad luck rather than design, which was the wrong kind of death, but the Vikings couldn't control every variable in a three-way battle. He'd been fighting near Ælla, staying close to the king because distance meant vulnerability. When Osbert's cavalry, a small mounted unit that had been trying to flank the Viking left, got pushed into Ælla's formation by Halfdan's counterattack. Horses broke through the shield wall, created chaos, and in that chaos, a mounted Saxon warrior brought his sword down on what he thought was a Viking and split Osric's skull to the jaw. The thegn went down without making a sound, dead before he understood what happened. A Viking warrior who'd been tracking him, Halfdan had given specific orders about this target, saw the death, saw the mounted Saxon who'd done it, and made a decision that Ivar would have approved of. He dragged Osric's body out of the immediate fighting, checked for life, found none, and left him there. Dead was dead, and while it meant they couldn't execute him properly, at least it was one name they could confirm. The battle had been going for an hour when the first formation started to break, not from valor or cowardice, but from exhaustion and mathematics. Ælla's line was down to maybe 250 effectives. The rest dead or wounded or simply gone, melted away into the chaos. Osbert's garrison had lost a third of its strength trying to flank the Vikings and discovering that Vikings didn't flank easily. The Great Heathen Army had taken casualties too, maybe 200 warriors down, but they'd started with numerical superiority and professional discipline, which meant the exchange rate favored them. More importantly, they had a unified command. The Saxons had two kings who hated each other trying to fight a common enemy while also watching for betrayal, and that divided attention was costing them men they couldn't afford to lose. Ælla saw his line collapsing, saw Osbert's forces being pushed back toward York's gates, saw the Viking formation wheeling to crush both Saxon armies between hammer and anvil. He made the decision that any competent commander would make in that position: order a fighting retreat. Try to pull his surviving men back south, live to rebuild, and try again. But Bjorn had been waiting for exactly that decision. The moment Ælla's line began its withdrawal, Bjorn's formation surged forward, not trying to engage the whole force, but targeting the cluster around the king himself. 20 Vikings, heavily armored, moving with coordinated brutality. They hit Ælla's bodyguard like a spear point, killed 4 men in the first exchange, and then Bjorn was through the line and facing the king directly. Ælla fought. Not well. He was exhausted, injured, old enough that stamina mattered more than skill at this point. But he fought because surrendering meant whatever came after. He got his sword up to block Bjorn's first strike, managed a counter-thrust that would have been dangerous if he'd had the strength behind it. And then Bjorn simply grabbed him. Not elegant, not technical, just raw strength, overwhelming resistance. Bjorn's shield came up into Ælla's face, broke something, staggered him backward. 3 Vikings piled onto the king, bearing him down through weight rather than skill. Ælla tried to scream something, order, curse, prayer, but someone's hand was over his mouth, and then they were dragging him through the mud toward the Viking lines while his surviving bodyguards watched, calculating whether loyalty demanded they die trying to save a king who was already lost. Bjorn brought Ælla to Ivar personally, dropped him beside Beorhtric, who was still sitting where he'd been thrown an hour earlier. Ælla looked at the ealdorman, then at Ivar. And something in his expression suggested he'd known this was coming since the day they lowered Ragnar into that pit. "Do it. Finish it." His voice was hoarse from shouting commands, blood in his mouth from the broken jaw. Bjorn looked at Ivar, waiting for orders. Ivar studied the king for a long moment. "Not yet. I want him to see what we do to the others first. Tie them both. Make sure they watch." While Ælla and Beorhtric were being secured, the battle entered its final phase, which was less organized combat and more slaughter of armies that had lost coherence. Osbert's garrison tried to retreat into York, but found the gates closed. Whoever was commanding inside had decided that letting a broken force back in just meant bringing Vikings with them. Caught between the city walls and the Viking formation, Osbert's men broke. Not routed, just came apart as formations collapsed and men made individual decisions about whether dying for a deposed king was worth whatever afterlife they believed in. Osbert himself died in this phase, killed by a Viking axe to the chest, while trying to rally troops who weren't rallying anymore. His death was witnessed by maybe 10 men, none of whom cared enough to write it down with heroic details. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle would later record simply that both kings died at York. It wouldn't mention that one died fighting and the other died watching. The Vikings found Bishop Wulfhere trying to make it back to York's gates, walking with ecclesiastical dignity through a battlefield that had stopped caring about dignity hours earlier. He was surrounded by 4 warriors, not Vikings, not Saxons, unclear who they'd been fighting for, and he was blessing them with shaking hands while they looked around for anyone who might rescue a bishop, or at least care that killing clergy had theological consequences. Halfdan's men reached him first. They killed the 4 warriors efficiently, collected Wulfhere the same way you'd collect a horse that had wandered off, and brought him back to where Ivar waited. The bishop was shaking, whether from cold or fear was academic. He looked at Ælla and Beorhtric sitting bound in the mud, looked at Ivar watching from his cart with those winter eyes, and his ecclesiastical composure finally broke. "I have sanctuary. I'm a bishop. You cannot." Ivar cut him off with a gesture. "You blessed my father's execution. You called it holy. God's will, you said. So I'm curious, Bishop. Where's your God now?" The battlefield was quieting, not because the fighting had stopped everywhere, but because enough men were dead or running that organized combat had become impossible. The Vikings were consolidating, collecting prisoners who looked valuable and finishing wounded who didn't. Ælla's surviving forces had scattered south, maybe 100 men left out of 400, running because staying meant capture, and capture meant, whatever the stories would say, happened to Northumbrian kings who tortured Viking lords. York's gates remained closed. Inside, the city was calculating what came next, whether Ivar would honor his deal with Osbert now that Osbert was dead, whether new deals could be made that didn't involve everyone dying. The answer to that question depended on whether Ivar got his 4th name. Ælfwine was found hiding in a storage cellar beneath a merchant's house, 300 yards from where the battle had been fought. He'd been there since the fighting started, 16 years old, wearing armor that didn't quite fit, trying to look like a commoner while his face screamed nobility to anyone who'd spent time in Ælla's court. The Vikings who found him weren't sure what to do. He matched descriptions they'd been given. Ælla's son, one of the 4 targets. But he was young enough that killing him felt different from killing the others. They brought him to Halfdan first, who brought him to Ivar, who looked at the boy for a long moment before speaking. "You're Ælfwine," not a question. The boy nodded, calculating whether honesty or lies had better survival odds. "I didn't kill your father. I didn't even speak. I just stood there. Ivar acknowledged this with a slight nod. I know. That's why you're here. He gestured to where Ælla sat bound, watching his son's arrival with an expression that contained more emotion than anything he'd shown during the battle. Your father made you watch. So now you'll watch what happens to men who make shows out of executions. The boy was pushed down beside the others, not tied. He wasn't dangerous, just young and terrified. Ælla looked at his son, and for the first time since his capture, spoke with something other than defiance or acceptance. Let him go. He's a boy. I gave the order. This is on me. Ivar watched this exchange with interest, like he was studying a specimen. That's almost convincing. But he stayed. He watched. Under Viking law, the witness who remains silent shares guilt. He looked at Ælfwine directly. You could have looked away. You could have left the room. You chose to watch. Now let's see if you can keep watching. The battlefield had gone quiet enough that you could hear individual sounds again. Wounded men making noises that weren't quite words, ravens arriving to investigate the dead, someone's horse still screaming in the distance where it had broken a leg and nobody had bothered to finish it. The Viking army stood in loose formation, not celebrating, just existing in that post-battle space where adrenaline was draining and exhaustion hadn't quite set in yet. Ivar had his brothers bring the 4 prisoners, 3 living, 1 corpse, to the center of what had been the battle's main killing ground. Osric's body lay where they'd found it, skull split. Recognizable, but barely. Beorhtric sat with his arms tied behind his back, face swelling but eyes still defiant. Wulfhere was praying loudly enough that everyone could hear it, quoting psalms about deliverance that weren't being answered. Ælla watched all of this with the expression of a man who'd already died internally and was just waiting for his body to catch up. And Ælfwine sat apart, not tied but not free, watching his father watch their deaths approach. Ivar stood. His brothers supported him, held him upright because his legs wouldn't bear weight, and addressed the assembled army in a voice that carried across the field. This was theater now, legal proceeding performed for witnesses who'd spread the story across England and back to Scandinavia. 18 months ago, these men killed Ragnar Lothbrok, not in battle, not with honor. They threw him into a pit of serpents and watched him die slowly for their entertainment. He let that statement sit, let the army absorb it, let the captured men hear their crime named publicly. Viking law requires blood debt, equivalent harm. These men chose torture and display, so we'll give them what they gave my father: proportional punishment, public execution, and a message that lasts long enough that no Saxon king ever forgets what it costs to break a treaty. What happened next took 3 hours, and it became the part of the story that people would argue about for centuries. Whether it happened the way the sagas described, whether the blood eagle was real or medieval propaganda, whether any of this was about justice or just revenge, wearing a legal costume. The historical record is ambiguous enough that you can believe either version. What's certain is that 4 men went into that afternoon as prisoners, and by sunset, Northumbria understood that Viking revenge wasn't a metaphor. Osric was already dead, which meant he escaped the worst of it. The Vikings displayed his corpse anyway, propped against a broken shield, head at the wrong angle, a visual reminder of what happened to men who suggested snake pits as execution methods. That was mercy by comparison to what came next. Beorhtric died by beheading, which was the best death available given the circumstances. Quick, professional, the kind of execution that warriors gave each other when there was respect underneath the killing. He was brought forward, forced to his knees, given a moment to speak final words if he wanted them. He said nothing, just looked at Ivar one last time with something that might have been understanding. They were both soldiers, both following codes that required this, both trapped by decisions that had been made months earlier when someone chose theater over pragmatism. Bjorn performed the execution with an axe, single stroke, efficient. Beorhtric's head came off clean, and his body slumped forward without the dramatic flourishes that saga writers would add later. He got a warrior's death because he'd acted like a warrior. That was the proportionality Ivar had promised. Wulfhere died by drowning, which took longer and was considerably worse. They brought a barrel, filled it from a nearby stream, and forced the bishop's head under while he thrashed and quoted scripture and begged for mercy that wasn't coming. Baptism in reverse. Ivar called it. The man who'd made murder holy getting blessed with water that wouldn't save him. It took maybe 4 minutes before Wulfhere stopped moving, which was 4 minutes of watching a man learn exactly how his theology felt when it was used as a weapon against him. Some of the Vikings looked away, not from mercy but from discomfort, because drowning wasn't warriors' work. It was the kind of killing that felt cowardly even when the victim deserved it. Ivar watched the whole thing without expression, and when Wulfhere finally went still, ordered the body displayed beside Osric's. 2 names down, 1 to go, and then the question of the boy. Ælla was brought forward last, which meant he'd watched his ealdorman beheaded and his bishop drowned before his turn came. The blood eagle, if it happened, took place just before sunset, which gave the whole thing the theatrical lighting that saga writers would obsess over for centuries. The method, as described in later sources, involved cutting the ribs from the spine and pulling the lungs out through the back to resemble wings. Anatomically possible if you had sharp tools and strong hands, and a victim who was restrained properly. Medically horrific. Death would come from blood loss and shock within minutes, not hours, which meant the extended torture that saga accounts describe was probably exaggeration. What actually happened is unclear. The sagas say it happened exactly as described. Historical sources note that no contemporary account confirms it, and archaeological evidence doesn't support routine use of this method. The most likely truth is somewhere between. Something brutal happened to Ælla. Brutal enough that people remembered it and added details, but probably not the surgical precision that later writers claimed. What's certain is that Ælla died last, died badly, and died with his son watching from 30 feet away, which was the real punishment. Not the method of death, but the forced witnessing. The same thing Ælla had required of Ælfwine when Ragnar died. Ivar made sure the boy saw everything, not because he enjoyed it, but because the lesson required a witness who'd survive to tell it. When it was finally over and Ælla's body was displayed beside the other 3, Ivar had himself carried over to where Ælfwine sat shaking, probably in shock, definitely traumatized in ways that would last the rest of his life, however long that turned out to be. Stand up. The boy stood on legs that barely worked. Ivar studied him. You watched my father die. You did nothing. Viking law says you share guilt. He let that hang for a moment, let Ælfwine understand that his death was still on the table. Then, but you were 16. You were scared. Your father was king. So here's your sentence. Exile. You leave Northumbria. You never come back. You never take your father's name again. If I see you in England after today, I'll kill you myself. But today, you live. Ælfwine stared at him, not understanding why mercy was happening when nothing else about this day suggested mercy was possible. Why? His voice cracked on the word. Ivar's response was quiet, almost gentle, and somehow worse than the executions had been. Because my father wouldn't have killed a boy for being afraid. And I'm not him, but I can try to remember what he'd want. They released the boy. He ran. The Vikings watched him disappear toward York's gates, which opened just long enough to let him through, then closed again. Whether he lived or died after that, history doesn't record. The chronicles lose track of Ælfwine after November 1st, 866, which means either he died on the roads or he survived under another name, and both possibilities felt like punishment for someone who'd spent the afternoon watching his father and his father's court die in ways that made quick deaths look like blessings. The battlefield was littered with bodies, maybe 500 Saxons, 200 Vikings, enough blood that the ground would be dark for weeks. The survivors on all sides were too exhausted to do anything but exist. The Vikings established a perimeter around York, not besieging yet, just making it clear that the city was surrounded and negotiations would happen on Ivar's terms. Inside York, the remaining lords were calculating whether opening the gates to new masters was better than starving through winter while surrounded. The answer was obvious. It always had been. Ivar sat in his cart as the sun set, looking at the 4 bodies displayed in a row: Osric's corpse from the battle, Beorhtric headless, Wulfhere waterlogged, Ælla in whatever condition the execution had left him. 4 men who'd stood around a pit 18 months earlier and watched a Viking lord die slowly for their political theater. 4 men who'd assumed that power insulated them from consequences, that killing a famous raider wouldn't cost more than they could afford to pay. They'd been wrong about the cost. They'd been wrong about the bill coming due, and now they were decorations in a message that would echo through every Saxon kingdom from York to Wessex. This is what happens when you torture prisoners for show. Bjorn approached, exhausted, covered in other people's blood. "We did it. Everything you planned." Ivar didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was empty. "Yes." Bjorn heard something in that tone. "So why do you look like we lost?" Ivar stared at the bodies for a long moment, then spoke with the kind of honesty that only comes from extreme fatigue and the recognition that revenge doesn't actually fix grief. "Because I spent 18 months thinking about 4 men dying, and now they're dead, and I still wake up expecting to see father. The killing was done. The revenge was complete. The blood debt was paid according to Viking law and Ivar's careful calibration of proportional punishment. Everything had gone according to plan, which was the problem. Because plans were supposed to make you feel like you'd accomplished something, and all Ivar felt was empty. Not satisfied, not vindicated, just hollow, standing in a field full of corpses, holding a wooden list with 4 names that didn't need to be carved anymore because the work was finished. Revenge doesn't resurrect. It just adds more bodies to the pile and tells you that's close enough. The Great Heathen Army would take York 3 days later, negotiate terms with the surviving lords, install puppet rulers, and begin the transformation of Northumbria into a Viking kingdom that would last almost a century. But that was administration. That was politics. That was the boring work of turning conquest into governance. The part that people would remember, the part that would become saga and legend and cautionary tale, was this: 4 men died badly because they killed 1 man worse, and the son who watched his father die in a snake pit made sure the men responsible understood exactly what that felt like from the other side. Whether that was justice or atrocity depends on which legal system you're using to judge it. Viking law said it was proportional. Christian theology called it barbarism. Modern sensibilities call it both. What's certain is that after November 1st, 866, Saxon kings thought very carefully before executing Viking prisoners in creative ways, because the lesson had been taught thoroughly enough that nobody wanted a refresher course. York opened its gates 3 days later. Not because the Vikings breached the walls, but because the people inside did arithmetic. Winter was coming, food stores were adequate but not generous, and the army camped outside had just displayed 4 corpses in ways that suggested patience wasn't their limiting factor. The city's remaining lords sent envoys offering terms: acknowledge Viking authority, pay tribute, keep your positions if you swear loyalty to whoever the Great Heathen Army installed as the new king. Practical surrender dressed as negotiation, the kind of deal that happens when everyone knows the war is over but protocol requires pretending it's still being decided. Ivar accepted without modification, which told you something about his priorities. He didn't want to rule Northumbria personally. He wanted it pacified, taxable, and governed by someone who understood that Viking revenge wasn't theoretical anymore. The occupation proceeded with bureaucratic efficiency that would have impressed Roman administrators. The Vikings didn't sack the city, didn't burn churches, didn't engage in the theatrical atrocities that Saxon chroniclers expected and kind of wanted to write about. They inventoried the treasury, assessed the tax base, identified which thegns controlled which territories, and began the tedious work of turning military conquest into civil administration. Ivar installed a puppet king, some Saxon noble with distant royal bloodline claims and a strong survival instinct, who would collect taxes and Viking interests and maintain the appearance that Northumbria was still being governed by Northumbrians. Clean work, professional. The kind of conquest that lasts because it doesn't try to replace everything, just redirect who profits from the existing system. But the efficiency couldn't hide what the campaign had cost the people who'd fought it. Ubba, who'd led the left flank and personally captured Beorhtric, sat in what had been Ælla's hall drinking himself toward unconsciousness most nights, not celebrating victory, but trying to forget the specific ways men had died during that 6-hour slaughter outside the walls. He'd killed dozens of people in his life, most of them in honest combat where both sides had chosen to be there, and he was discovering that killing soldiers was different from orchestrating executions, even when the executions were legally justified. Halfdan took the opposite approach, threw himself into administration with manic focus, treating the occupation like a logistics problem that could be solved through proper resource allocation and careful record keeping. He was good at it, better than anyone expected. Within a month, he had York's tax system running more efficiently than it had under Saxon rule, which was either impressive or depressing depending on whether you valued competence or legitimacy more. Bjorn left. Not immediately, but within weeks of the city's fall, he announced he was returning to Scandinavia, taking his share of the plunder and his warriors and whatever goodwill his father's name still carried in the north. The official reason was that he had lands in Sweden that needed managing, alliances that required his presence, the usual excuses that powerful men give when they want to be somewhere else. The real reason was visible in how he looked at Ivar during those final weeks, like he was seeing someone he recognized less each day. They'd accomplished what they came for. 4 men were dead. The blood debt was satisfied. But the brother who designed that revenge, who'd spent 18 months calibrating proportional punishment and legal justification, had disappeared somewhere inside the process and been replaced by someone colder. Bjorn didn't say this directly. He just clasped Ivar's arm, said something about how father would be proud, and left before Ivar could respond. Ivar sat in that emptiness for months, ruling Northumbria from a throne that wasn't his, through a puppet king who didn't matter, administering a kingdom he'd conquered for reasons that felt less clear as time passed. The list, that piece of driftwood with 4 names carved deep, sat on a table in his chamber, and he'd run his fingers over it sometimes late at night, tracing letters that had defined his existence for a year and a half and now meant nothing because the work was complete. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written decades later by monks who wanted to make the Vikings look like apocalyptic monsters, recorded that Ivar was cruel, that he took pleasure in Saxon suffering, that he was a tyrant whose rule was characterized by brutality and excess. That's propaganda. The reality was worse. He was competent, efficient, and completely hollow. Cruelty requires passion. Ivar had used up his passion on 4 specific deaths and had nothing left for general tyranny. He administered Northumbria the way you'd manage a business you'd inherited but never wanted, keeping it functional out of obligation rather than interest. The Great Heathen Army didn't stop with Northumbria, because armies that stop conquering tend to dissolve as warriors decide that farming pays better than standing watch. In 869, they moved south into East Anglia, the kingdom that had sheltered them during that first winter and probably regretted the hospitality. King Edmund, the same Edmund who'd taken Viking silver and thought he was being clever, refused tribute when Ivar's forces arrived, demanding payment for past hospitality. Edmund had spent 3 years watching the Vikings conquer Northumbria and deciding he'd make his stand for Christian England, which was brave and stupid in roughly equal measure. The Vikings killed him. And while the chronicles claim they did it through elaborate torture involving arrows and eventual beheading, the reality was probably less theatrical and more efficient. Dead is dead, and Edmund's martyrdom was built by monks afterward who needed saints more than they needed accurate casualty reports. What mattered was that by 870, the Great Heathen Army controlled 2 of England's 7 kingdoms and showed no signs of slowing down. But Ivar was done. Not physically, he lived at least until 873, possibly longer depending on which historical sources you trust, but psychologically, he'd achieved everything his plan required. The 4 men were dead. Northumbria was conquered. His father's death had been answered with proportional revenge according to Viking legal principles. The spreadsheet was balanced, and it hadn't fixed anything. His father was still dead. His brothers were scattered or changed or drinking themselves numb. The kingdom he'd won felt like an obligation rather than a prize. Somewhere around 870, Ivar disappeared from English records, which probably means he left England, possibly returned to Ireland where he had connections, possibly died and nobody bothered to record it with any detail. The chronicles mention his death vaguely, without location or circumstance, which tells you that by the time it happened, nobody cared enough to document it properly. The man who'd orchestrated the most elaborate revenge killing in Viking Age history ended his story as a footnote, mentioned only because later writers needed to explain what happened to Ragnar's sons. His brothers lasted longer in the historical record, but not in ways that suggested happiness or fulfillment. Halfdan ruled Northumbria until 877, when he died fighting the Irish in some forgotten campaign that accomplished nothing strategic. Ubba died in 878, killed at the Battle of Sinwit in Devon by Saxon forces who'd finally learned how to counter Viking tactics. Bjorn returned to Sweden, possibly became king, possibly died in his bed. The records are ambiguous and contradictory. None of them are remembered for anything except being Ragnar's sons and conquering kingdoms that would eventually be reconquered by Saxons who remembered the Great Heathen Army as the apocalypse that taught England to unify or die. The blood eagle, that execution method that became the thing everyone remembers about this story, is where history meets mythology, and they get into a knife fight about what actually happened. The saga sources, written centuries after the events, describe it in anatomical detail. Ribs cut from spine, lungs pulled through the wound, death that lasted long enough for the victim to experience every stage of dying. Archaeological evidence? Non-existent. No skeletal remains show evidence of this specific trauma pattern. Contemporary chronicles? Silent or ambiguous. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle mentions that Ælla died at York, killed by the Vikings, but gives no method. Later, Saxon sources add details that smell like propaganda designed to make Vikings look monstrous. So did it happen? Maybe. Possibly not the way the sagas describe. Too surgical. Too elaborate for battlefield conditions. But something happened that was bad enough that people remembered it, and memory has a way of adding details until the story becomes what people need it to be, rather than what it was. Here's what we can say with confidence. Ælla died badly. His death was public. It was designed to send a message, and that message was received clearly enough that Saxon kings spent the next generation being very careful about how they treated Viking prisoners, because the lesson about proportional revenge had been taught thoroughly. Whether the specific method was blood eagle or something equally brutal but less cinematically memorable, the functional outcome was the same. Execute a Viking lord for theater. His sons will make your death a seminar that everyone attends, whether they want to or not. The irony that history buries under all the gore and conquest is what happened to Ælfwine, the boy who watched, who did nothing, who received mercy when everyone else received judgment. He's the one who survived. The chronicles lose him after York falls, which means either he died anonymously on the roads or he lived under another name, and both possibilities contain the same lesson. The men who actively participated in Ragnar's execution died in ways that became legendary. The boy who was merely complicit got to walk away, traumatized but breathing, carrying the story of what happens when powerful men decide theater is worth more than pragmatism. That's the punishment that lasted longest. Not death, but survival. Forcing someone to live with what they witnessed, making them remember every detail of how their father's court died while they watched helplessly from 30 feet away. The Great Heathen Army's conquest reshaped England permanently. Not immediately. It took 2 centuries for the full implications to develop, but the chain of causation runs straight from November 1st, 866, to the England we recognize today. The Viking invasion forced Saxon kingdoms to either unify or be destroyed piecemeal, which is how Wessex under Alfred became the dominant power, which led to the eventual unification of England as a single kingdom, which created the political entity that would later conquer much of the known world. You can draw a direct line from Ragnar dying in a snake pit to the British Empire, which is the kind of butterfly effect that historians love and participants never intended. Ælla thought he was securing his legitimacy. Ivar thought he was avenging his father. What they actually did was trigger a reorganization of English political structures that would echo forward for a millennium. The specific details, who held what territory, which battles happened where, how many men died in which engagements, mattered intensely to the people living through them, and matter not at all to the outcome. England was going to be conquered by Scandinavians at some point in the 9th century. Too much wealth, too little unity, too many coastlines that Vikings could exploit. Ragnar's death and Ivar's revenge just determined the timing and personnel. Ælla's kingdom was always going to fall. The only question was whether it fell to Vikings, or to Saxon rivals, or to internal collapse. And Ælla's decision to throw a famous Viking into a snake pit meant it fell to Vikings first, which established precedent and momentum that carried the conquest forward for decades. But here's what that historical perspective misses. It didn't feel inevitable to the people living it. Ælla made a choice. He had options: ransom, treaty, quick execution, exile. He chose theater because he needed legitimacy and thought Viking suffering would provide it. That choice, made in a timber hall in 865 by a nervous usurper trying to look strong, killed thousands of people who never heard Ragnar's name. The soldiers who died at York, the civilians in villages that got burned during the campaign, the Saxon nobility that got replaced by Viking administrators, the entire kingdom of East Anglia, conquered because the Great Heathen Army needed to keep moving to keep cohesion. All of that traces back to one decision about execution methods, which is the kind of causation that makes free will look less like a gift and more like a weapon you're holding by the wrong end. Ivar understood this eventually, which is probably why he left England. Not because he felt guilty. Guilt requires believing you had better options, and from Ivar's perspective, Viking law required what he did. But because he'd achieved everything his plan demanded and discovered that achievement was just another word for now what. Revenge is seductive because it offers a clear goal. Hurt the people who hurt you, make them pay, balance the scales. But scales don't balance. You can pile enough bodies on one side that it looks balanced from a distance. But grief doesn't work like mathematics. You can't subtract loss by adding death. You can only add death and call it close enough. The wooden list with 4 names, the one Ivar carved on that ship crossing the North Sea, the one he carried for 18 months as navigation and compass and purpose, was never found. Probably burned in some forgotten fire, or rotted in English mud, or simply lost when Ivar left England and took nothing with him because what was there to take? The kingdom he'd won was administered by subordinates. The revenge he'd achieved was complete. His father was still dead. His brothers were scattered. The list was obsolete, just a piece of wood with scratches on it, meaning nothing except to the man who'd carved it, and he was tired of looking at it. Here's the universal truth that this story teaches if you're willing to learn it. Revenge works. That's the part that nobody wants to admit, but everyone needs to hear. Ivar got what he wanted. The 4 men who killed his father died badly and publicly. The kingdom that harbored them became a Viking possession. The legal precedent was established. Execute Viking lords dishonorably, and their sons will make you regret it in ways that last centuries. Success by every measurable standard except one. It didn't bring his father back. It didn't make grief go away. It didn't fill the hole that Ragnar's death had carved into Ivar's chest. Revenge doesn't resurrect. It just adds more bodies to the pile and calls that justice, which is close enough for law, but not close enough for a son who wanted his father to see what he'd accomplished. The snake pit beneath York, the actual physical pit where Ragnar died, was filled in sometime in the late 9th century when the Vikings expanded York's fortifications. You can't visit it. There's no marker. Archaeology suggests it was probably located beneath what's now Coppergate, under a shopping center where tourists buy Viking-themed merchandise, without knowing they're standing where Northumbria's last independent king made the worst decision of his life. That's fitting. History buries its lessons under parking lots and gift shops, making sure we learn nothing except that the past is a place where dramatic things happen to people who aren't us, which means we're safe from making the same mistakes. We're not. The same calculations that drove Ælla, need for legitimacy, fear of looking weak, theatrical brutality as political messaging, drive politicians now. The same grief that drove Ivar, loss turning into purpose, purpose turning into vengeance, vengeance turning into law, drives people everywhere who've lost something irreplaceable and need someone to pay for it. A Saxon monk, writing in Winchester 30 years after York fell, recorded the events of 866 with the careful distance of someone trying to make sense of trauma. In that year, the heathen army came to York, and there was great slaughter. Both kings died, and what was done to King Ælla we will not describe, for fear of corrupting young souls with tales of cruelty. Let it be known only that the pagans showed that treachery begets treachery, and cruelty begets worse. That last line, cruelty begets worse, became the lesson that Saxon kings took from the Great Heathen Army. Not that Vikings were unbeatable, or that resistance was futile, but that escalation had consequences, that turning prisoners into entertainment created debts that had to be paid, that sometimes the smart move was boring pragmatism instead of memorable brutality. The blood eagle became a threat that Vikings used for generations after Ivar was dead. Give us what we want, or we'll do to you what Ivar did to Ælla. Whether it was real or legendary didn't matter. The threat worked because everyone remembered York, remembered that revenge was patient enough to cross oceans and methodical enough to hunt specific names through chaos, remembered that Vikings kept receipts, and eventually those receipts came due. That's power, not the ability to hurt people, but the ability to make people remember how you hurt someone once and let their imagination do the rest. Ivar's legacy isn't the territory he conquered or the battles he won. It's the lesson he taught about cost and consequence. You can kill a Viking lord. You can make it theatrical. You can use it to shore up your legitimacy and scare your rivals. But you can't do it for free. The bill arrives later, carried by sons who spent months planning exactly how to make you regret being born. And when it arrives, you pay in full with interest calculated at rates that would make loan sharks blush. The pit where Ragnar died, filled in and buried under centuries of English construction, still exists if you know where to dig. The Vikings who took York never destroyed it. They filled it deliberately, carefully, with stone and earth and probably some ritual significance that didn't make it into the historical record. Not because they were sentimental, but because leaving it open was a liability. Someone might fall in or use it, or turn it into something it wasn't meant to be. Better to bury it, mark it closed. Let it become archaeology that future generations would debate and analyze and probably get wrong in interesting ways. But here's what archaeologists never found and never will: closure. You can excavate pits and analyze bones and reconstruct battle formations from mass graves. But you can't dig up the moment when Ivar realized revenge hadn't fixed what it was supposed to fix. When he understood that proportional justice was just another word for elaborate distraction from grief, when the four bodies stopped being targets and started being corpses that proved nothing except that he was good at killing specific people for specific reasons. That moment doesn't leave artifacts. It just leaves people changed in ways that show up later, in decisions that don't make sense unless you understand what the person sacrificed to get where they are. Ivar Ragnarsson conquered a kingdom to avenge his father, killed 4 men according to Viking legal principles, established precedent that lasted centuries, and achieved absolutely everything his plan demanded. And somewhere in the gap between achievement and meaning, he became the kind of person his father wouldn't have recognized: efficient, hollow, technically right, and emotionally bankrupt. That's the cost nobody calculates when they start planning revenge. Not the bodies it requires, but the person you become who's capable of managing that many bodies without flinching. The last historical mention of Ivar comes from Irish annals around 873, noting his death without detail or circumstance, just a name in a list of people who died that year. No saga, no poem, no great funeral with ships and flames, just a notation that someone who'd mattered once had stopped mattering, and the world moved on without him, because that's what the world does. His brothers got better deaths, Halfdan in battle, Ubba defending England from Saxon counterattack. Ivar just disappeared from the record, which suggests he died somewhere that nobody cared to document, doing something that wasn't worth remembering. But the lesson he taught, that revenge is mathematics written in blood and someone always checks the accounting, that outlasted him. Saxon kings spent generations trying to figure out how to deal with Vikings without triggering another York, how to fight without provoking elaborately calibrated vengeance, how to win wars without losing the peace to sons who kept lists. They never quite solved it. You can't, really. Violence breeds response, and the only way to prevent escalation is to not start the sequence, which means accepting insults and provocations that feel unacceptable to people who need to project strength. The tragedy isn't that Ælla died badly, or that Ivar became hollow, or that hundreds of men were killed for one man's execution. The tragedy is that it was avoidable at every step. Ragnar could have stayed in Scandinavia. Ælla could have taken the ransom. Ivar could have let it go. Any of those decisions breaks the chain, but nobody made those decisions because nobody thought they were good options at the time. And by the time everyone realized the sequence was unstoppable, it was too late to do anything except die or kill and hope that one of those options looked like winning. So here's what we're left with. A snake pit buried under a shopping center. 4 executions that may or may not have happened the way the stories say. A kingdom that changed hands because someone chose theater over pragmatism. And a lesson about revenge that nobody learns because the lesson is don't start, and everyone always thinks they can manage the finish. Ivar's wooden list is gone. The 4 men he hunted are dust. The kingdom he conquered was reconquered within decades. And somewhere in the gap between revenge and satisfaction, between justice and hollow victory, sits the truth that nobody wants to hear. You can win and still lose. You can get everything you planned for and discover that plans don't account for the person you become achieving them. Witness this. The cold open we started with. A man lowering into darkness, serpents moving in straw, suns across the sea carving names into driftwood. That moment created everything that followed. Armies, sieges, executions, kingdoms changing hands, England reshaping itself to survive the Viking Age. One decision about how to kill a prisoner became the hinge point that centuries turned on, and nobody involved understood that's what they were doing. They thought they were solving immediate problems. They were actually writing history's footnotes about the price of theatrical brutality and what happens when grief becomes operational planning. The pit's still there, under the Coppergate shopping center, filled with rubble and forgetting. You walk over it buying souvenirs, never knowing you're standing where Northumbria died because someone thought snake pits were more impressive than ransoms. That's how history works. Important moments become parking spaces, and only people who study footnotes remember that anything significant happened there at all. If you made it this far through 2 hours of Viking revenge and blood debt and kingdoms collapsing under the weight of bad decisions, leave a comment about the worst revenge story you've ever heard, fictional or real, yours or someone else's. And if you want to see how Alfred the Great finally stopped the Great Heathen Army and saved Saxon England from permanent conquest, that story's coming next. Same brutal honesty, same uncomfortable lessons, different king learning the same truth. Sometimes the only way to win is to not play the game your enemy wants you to play. The last thing Ivar saw, assuming the Irish annals are accurate and he lived long enough to see it, was England learning to fight back. Not immediately, not dramatically, but methodically, copying Viking tactics, building the kind of organized defense that turned raids into sieges and sieges into stalemates. The Great Heathen Army that had seemed unstoppable in 866 was bleeding slowly by 873, losing ground to Saxon forces that had learned the lesson Northumbria died teaching: unite or be conquered piecemeal. That's the real legacy of Ragnar's death and Ivar's revenge. Not that Vikings were monsters or that Saxons were victims, but that escalation has costs everyone pays, and sometimes the people who teach lessons don't survive to see if anyone learned them. Revenge is a hole you dig for someone else and then fall into yourself. Ivar dug his hole perfectly. Proportional depth, legal justification, built to exact specifications. And when he was done, he stood at the bottom looking up at sky, wondering why achievement felt like burial. The wooden list is gone. The men are dust. The kingdom changed hands 4 times before anyone stopped counting. But the lessons still carved deep enough to feel in the dark. Some debts get paid, no matter how long it takes, no matter what it costs, no matter who's left standing when the accounting's done. That's not a threat. That's just history, teaching the same class over and over, and we keep failing the test. If this deep dive into Viking revenge and the mathematics of violence was worth your time, smash that subscribe button and hit the bell. We're covering forgotten battles, buried histories, and the moments that changed everything while no one was watching.